My name is Marcus Thompson, I'm 32, and I never imagined the people who raised me could be so heartless until the night they chose champagne over my dying child. When my 8-year-old son Jake was fighting for his life in the hospital needing emergency surgery that would cost nearly $200,000, my wealthy parents were busy planning the most extravagant New Year's Eve party Denver had ever seen. While I begged them to help save their grandson, they told me family reputation mattered more than his survival. But what they didn't expect was that their coldest decision would come back to destroy everything they held dear. 2 years later, when karma finally caught up and they lost everything, they came crawling back with tears in their eyes, begging for the same mercy they had refused to show my son. What I did next changed our family forever and left everyone who heard this story completely stunned. Let me take you back to where it began. To understand how we got there, you need to know about my childhood. I grew up as the forgotten son in the Sterling family, watching my younger brother Brandon receive every ounce of love and attention while I stood invisible in the corner. The moment that defined my entire childhood happened when I was 14. I had just received my state standardized test scores. Perfect marks in mathematics, the highest in my grade. I remember running home from school, clutching that paper, so excited to finally make my parents proud. I burst through the kitchen door of our suburban home, practically vibrating with excitement. "Mom, Dad, look." I held up the test results, my heart pounding with anticipation. My mother, Patricia, barely glanced up from her expensive handbag, where she was organizing her credit cards for an afternoon shopping trip. "Good," she said flatly, not even looking at the paper. "You did what you were supposed to do." That was it. No celebration, no proud phone calls to relatives, no special dinner. Just cold acknowledgement that I had met basic expectations. But 3 days later, everything changed when Brandon came home with a B+ in history. Suddenly, our kitchen transformed into a celebration venue. My parents ordered a cake from the most expensive bakery in town, invited our relatives over, and spent the entire evening toasting Brandon's exceptional academic achievement. I stood in the corner watching them laugh and cheer, as if my 12-year-old brother had just won a full scholarship to Harvard. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the pattern of my entire childhood. When I won the state junior design competition at 16, spending months perfecting my architectural drawings, my father Richard merely nodded and said, "Nice hobby, son." But when Brandon made the JV basketball team, not as a starter, just barely making the bench, my parents bought him a brand new car and threw a party complete with a professional photographer. The disparity became even more stark when it came time for college. I worked 3 part-time jobs throughout high school, saved every penny, and earned a partial scholarship to the University of Colorado's prestigious architecture program. The day I got my acceptance letter, I ran to tell my parents, thinking, surely this would be the moment they'd finally be proud. My mother glanced at the letter while applying her lipstick in the hallway mirror. "That must not have been easy," she said. "Try your best." Then she walked away to get ready for her charity luncheon. But when Brandon got accepted to the local community college 2 years later, they rented out the country club ballroom, hired a live band, and flooded social media with captions like, "So proud of our beloved son." The celebration lasted until midnight. I learned early that in the Sterling family, effort didn't lead to recognition. Love was reserved for Brandon, who never had to try to earn it. He just had to exist, and attention naturally gravitated toward him like he was the sun, and the rest of us were distant planets. My parents, Richard and Patricia Sterling, weren't struggling financially. They owned Sterling Furniture Empire, a successful business that had been growing for decades. My father was a respected businessman in Denver, and my mother was active in all the right social circles. We lived in a beautiful home in the suburbs, and image was everything to them. But their love was distributed unequally, and I was always on the losing end. By the time I turned 18, I had learned to expect nothing from them. I stopped feeling hurt when they forgot my birthday, but threw elaborate celebrations for Brandon. I stopped hoping they'd attend my school events or show interest in my achievements. I had emotionally prepared myself for a lifetime of being overlooked. What I never prepared for was the day when their indifference wouldn't just hurt me, it would threaten the life of my son. As I packed my belongings for college, my parents were already focused on Brandon's bright future in the family business. They spoke about grooming him to take over Sterling Furniture Empire, about the networking opportunities they'd provide, about the legacy he'd continue. They never once asked about my plans or dreams. I moved out for college, carrying one devastating lesson in my family. I would always be the backup son, the spare, the one who had to prove his worth, while Brandon simply had to breathe. I thought I had made peace with that reality. I thought I had moved beyond needing their approval or recognition. I was wrong. Because 16 years later, when my 8-year-old son was dying in a hospital bed, I discovered that sometimes parental indifference isn't just about being forgotten at dinner. Sometimes it's a cold, sharp blade that cuts through every defense you've built, forcing you to face the truth about the people who raised you. And sometimes that truth is more devastating than you could ever imagine. College became my escape route, but more importantly, it became my proving ground. Those 4 years taught me that I didn't need my family's approval to succeed. I threw myself into architecture and design with the same intensity I had once reserved for trying to win my parents' love. The difference was this time my efforts actually paid off. After graduation in 2010, I spent the next few years working for established firms in Denver, learning the business side of design while saving every penny I could. I had a plan. I was going to build something of my own, something that would prove I didn't need the Sterling family legacy to make my mark on the world. In 2018, I took the leap and founded Thompson Design Studio. I started small sharing office space with a yoga instructor and a freelance photographer in the Highland neighborhood. My first client was a local coffee shop owner who wanted to create a more welcoming atmosphere. The budget was tiny, but I treated that project like it was designing the White House. Word spread slowly at first, then faster. I specialized in sustainable commercial design, creating spaces that weren't just beautiful, but functional and environmentally conscious. Restaurant owners started seeking me out, then retail stores, then small office buildings. By 2020, I had my own building and was employing 8 people. By 2024, Thompson Design Studio had 15 employees and was pulling in $2.5 million annually. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had built a more successful design business than my father's furniture empire in half the time. But the real transformation in my life came in 2018 when I met David Thompson. He was working as a construction project manager on a commercial renovation where I was designing the interior flow. I remember watching him coordinate the installation of smart building systems with such precision and care. We started talking about the relationship between form and function, about how spaces could make people feel safe and productive. David had this steady grounding presence that I had never experienced before. He didn't compete for attention or try to outshine anyone. He just showed up, did excellent work, and treated everyone with respect. When we started dating, I kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to reveal some hidden agenda or competitive streak. It never happened. We got married in 2019 inches, a small ceremony at Margaret and William Thompson's backyard. David's parents embraced me immediately, never once making me feel like an outsider or questioning my place in their son's life. Margaret, a retired elementary school teacher, and William, a retired union construction worker, had raised David with the kind of unconditional love I had only read about in books. The contrast with my own family was stark. Richard and Patricia sent a wedding gift but didn't attend the ceremony. They claimed they had a prior commitment to a charity gala that couldn't be rescheduled. Brandon was supposed to be my best man but canceled 3 days before the wedding, saying he had an important business trip. Margaret stepped in immediately. She told me that family isn't about blood, it's about who shows up when it matters. Standing at the altar looking at David and surrounded by the Thompson family, I finally understood what she meant. In 2016, we had adopted Jake as an infant through a private agency. The process had been lengthy and emotionally exhausting, but the moment they placed that tiny baby in my arms, I knew what it felt like to love someone more than your own life. Jake grew up to be curious and artistic, always building elaborate structures with blocks or drawing detailed pictures of buildings and airplanes. He had my creative streak and David's steady temperament. The only health concern was mild asthma that had developed when he turned 4, but it was well controlled with regular medications and seemed like such a minor issue. Our life wasn't extravagant, but it was rich in ways I had never experienced growing up. Sunday morning pancakes at Margaret and William's house became our weekly tradition. Jake would help his grandmother flip pancakes, while his grandfather read him the comics from the newspaper. These people who had no biological connection to me had given me more love and acceptance than my birth family ever had. My parents knew about our success, of course. Denver's business community isn't that large, and news of Thompson Design Studios' growth had reached their social circles. They occasionally mentioned my achievements at their cocktail parties, I heard, but always in passing, as if my success was somehow separate from the Sterling family narrative. They knew about their annual New Year's Eve party tradition, too. Every December, Patricia would send a formal invitation to what had become Denver's most exclusive social event. We always politely declined, preferring to spend New Year's Eve quietly at home with Jake. I thought I had made peace with keeping my distance from Richard, Patricia, and Brandon. I had built a life filled with people who actually cared about me. I had created the family I had always wanted but never had. What I didn't realize was that in December 2024, all of that carefully constructed peace was about to shatter completely. It started with what seemed like the most ordinary thing in the world. December 15th was a typical Sunday evening in our Highland neighborhood home. Jake was sitting at the kitchen table, working on his math homework, his tongue sticking out slightly in concentration the way it always did when he was focused. David was reviewing blueprints for a project starting the next week, and I was responding to client emails about a restaurant renovation. Then Jake coughed. Just once, but it had a different quality to it than his usual throat clearing. I glanced up from my laptop, but he was already back to his multiplication problems, so I didn't think much of it. By Tuesday, that single cough had multiplied into a persistent tickle that seemed to live in his chest. Nothing dramatic, just the kind of thing you expect when Colorado's winter weather starts getting harsh, and every kid in school is passing around germs. I made him hot tea with honey, and David read him an extra story at bedtime. Wednesday brought more coughing, especially at night. I found myself lying awake, listening to Jake's breathing through the thin walls of our modest home, counting the seconds between coughs. David suggested we might need to adjust the humidifier in Jake's room, thinking the dry winter air was irritating his asthma. By December 20th, something had shifted. The cough wasn't just persistent anymore. It was keeping Jake awake, and I could see him struggling to catch his breath after coughing fits. When David checked his temperature that evening, the thermometer read 101.3 degrees. I remember sitting on the edge of Jake's bed watching his small chest rise and fall with more effort than it should have taken. His appetite had been dropping for days, and the energetic boy who usually bounced off the walls after school was falling asleep on the couch during his favorite cartoons. The next morning we took him to Dr. Sarah Mitchell, his pediatrician. She listened to his chest for what felt like an eternity, her expression growing more concerned with each movement of the stethoscope. Bronchitis, she finally diagnosed, prescribing antibiotics and recommending increased nebulizer treatments for his asthma. But something in her eyes told me she wasn't entirely convinced this was routine bronchitis. She mentioned that Jake's asthma history made respiratory infections more complicated and asked us to call immediately if his breathing became more labored. Christmas Eve should have been magical. We always spent it at Margaret and William's house, a tradition that had become the highlight of Jake's year. Margaret would make her famous sugar cookies shaped like reindeer, and William would read The Night Before Christmas in his deep theatrical voice that made Jake giggle. But this year Jake barely touched his favorite cookies. He curled up on the couch halfway through dinner and fell asleep, his breathing shallow and his skin pale under the warm glow of the Christmas tree lights. Margaret pulled me aside while William carried Jake to the guest bedroom. Her voice was quiet but firm when she said, "This doesn't look like regular bronchitis, Marcus. I taught elementary school for 30 years. I've seen a lot of sick children, and something about this feels different." The day after Christmas, Jake's condition took a noticeable turn for the worse. His breathing had become more difficult, and he complained of tightness in his chest that wasn't responding to his usual asthma medications. The pale color Margaret had noticed was becoming more pronounced, and Jake was moving like every step required enormous effort. David was working double shifts at his new construction job, trying to complete projects before the insurance benefits from his new employer kicked in on January 15th. We had been without health coverage for 6 weeks while transitioning between his old job and new one, something that seemed like a manageable gap when we made the decision. Everyone gets sick in winter, we told ourselves. Jake's asthma was mild and well controlled. We could handle a few weeks without coverage. I was juggling urgent client calls about year-end project deadlines while trying to monitor Jake's every breath. The stress was making my own chest tight, and I found myself checking on him every hour during the night. December 27th changed everything. Jake woke up struggling to breathe, his lips tinged with blue around the edges. I called Dr. Mitchell's emergency line, and she told us to get to the hospital immediately. The drive to Presbyterian Street, Joseph Hospital, felt like it took forever and no time at all. Jake's small hand was cold in mine, and I kept talking to him about anything I could think of, desperate to keep him conscious and alert. David followed in his work truck, having rushed from a job site still covered in construction dust. As we pulled into the emergency department parking lot, I had no idea that our family was about to face the biggest crisis of our lives, or that the people I had once called family would reveal exactly who they truly were. The emergency department at Presbyterian Street Joseph Hospital moved with the kind of controlled urgency that told me this was serious. Within minutes of our arrival, Jake was whisked away to the pediatric intensive care unit, oxygen levels dangerously low according to the monitors that seemed to beep constantly around his small bed. Teams of doctors and nurses surrounded him, their movements precise and practiced as they worked to stabilize his breathing. I stood pressed against the glass wall of the PICU, watching my 8-year-old son disappear behind a maze of machines and medical equipment that I didn't understand, but knew meant he was fighting for his life. Dr. Amanda Chen, the pediatric surgeon on call, ordered what felt like endless tests. CT scans, blood work, genetic panels, X-rays from multiple angles. David and I took turns sleeping in the most uncomfortable hospital chairs I had ever encountered, neither of us willing to leave Jake's side for more than a few minutes at a time. The waiting was torture. Every beat from the monitors made my heart race. Every time a nurse adjusted something or checked a reading, I searched their faces for clues about what they were seeing. Jake looked so small in that hospital bed, dwarfed by all the equipment keeping track of his vital signs. December 29th arrived with the kind of news that changes your life forever. Dr. Chen pulled David and me into a small consultation room with fluorescent lighting that made everything look harsh and clinical. Her expression was serious but compassionate when she spread Jake's test results across the table. There was a complex mass in Jake's left lung, she explained, pressing against his airway and major blood vessels. The good news was that it wasn't malignant. The terrifying news was that its location made it extremely dangerous. Without surgical intervention within 72 hours, Jake's condition would become life-threatening. The surgery would take approximately 8 hours, she continued, requiring a specialized team and post-operative ICU care for a minimum of 10 days. They would need 24 to 48 hours to complete detailed surgical planning and provide us with an accurate financial estimate but preliminary costs were looking at somewhere between $150,000 and $200,000 depending on complications. I felt the blood drain from my face. David reached for my hand and I could feel him trembling as much as I was. Our combined savings account held exactly $28,000. David's new job insurance wouldn't become effective until January 15th, still more than 2 weeks away. His previous insurance had lapsed during the job transition, and Jake's asthma history had triggered pre-existing condition waiting periods with potential new coverage. The hospital financial counselor, a kind woman named Susan, who had clearly delivered this type of devastating news many times before, walked us through our options. Payment plans would require a 40% down payment upfront. Charity care applications existed but took 6 to 8 weeks to process. Insurance appeals could take 2 to 3 months even if we had active coverage. Jake didn't have weeks, let alone months. David immediately started researching emergency loans on his phone, calling banks and credit unions from the hospital corridor. Our debt-to-income ratio from recent business expansion meant automatic denials across the board. The house had equity, but home equity loans required weeks of processing time that Jake simply didn't have. I found myself staring at my phone, scrolling through my contact list, looking at a name I hadn't called in 8 months. Richard Sterling, father. The man who had given me life but had never really given me love. The grandfather who sent birthday cards with $50 bills but had never attended a single one of Jake's school plays or soccer games. For the first time since I was 18 years old, I was facing the possibility that I might need my parents. Not for emotional support or validation, but for something much more basic and desperate. I needed them to help me save my son's life. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had spent my entire adult life proving that I didn't need the Sterling family or their money. I had built my own success, created my own family, established my own legacy. But now, watching Jake struggle to breathe through machines and tubes, none of that mattered. Pride doesn't keep your child alive. Independence doesn't pay for life-saving surgery. All of my accomplishments meant nothing if I couldn't find a way to save the most important person in my world. The weight of helplessness was crushing me as Jake's breathing grew more labored despite the medical interventions. I knew that within hours I would have to swallow every ounce of pride I had ever possessed and beg the people who had never valued me to value my son. December 29th, 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I sat in the hospital corridor outside the PICU, watching Jake sleep fitfully behind the glass doors, his small chest rising and falling with the assistance of machines that were keeping him stable. David was at the nurse's station researching charity care options and discussing the possibility of transferring Jake to the county hospital, where payment plans might be more flexible, though the specialized care would be less advanced. I pulled out my phone and stared at the contact I hadn't touched in 8 months. Richard Sterling, father, the man who had taught me that love was conditional and approval had to be earned through achievements that were never quite good enough. My hands were shaking as I stepped outside into the cold Denver air that shocked my lungs and cleared my head just enough to dial the number. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, his voice as cold and distant as I remembered. Marcus. Unusual for you to call. The lack of warmth in his greeting shouldn't have surprised me, but it still stung. I forced myself to focus on Jake, not on my own hurt feelings. Dad, I need to talk to you about something important. Jake is in the hospital. He needs emergency surgery, and we're facing a financial crisis that I can't handle alone. There was a pause, and I could hear the sound of papers rustling in the background, as if he was reviewing documents while I explained that his grandson was fighting for his life. That's unfortunate, Marcus. Have you considered all your options? Hospitals have charity programs for situations like this. I explained that we had tried everything. The charity care applications would take weeks to process. Insurance appeals would take months that Jake didn't have. David's new job insurance wouldn't kick in for 2 more weeks, and Jake's asthma history created pre-existing condition complications with any new coverage we might secure. Dad, I'm asking for your help. A loan? A gift? Anything. We need about $80,000 to cover the down payment for surgery, and Jake needs this surgery within the next 2 days, or his condition could become life-threatening. The silence on the other end stretched so long that I thought the call had dropped. When Richard finally spoke, his voice carried the same dismissive tone I remembered from my childhood. Marcus, you know the holidays are extremely busy for us. Patricia and I have significant commitments all week. The timing is very inconvenient. I felt like I was 14 years old again, standing in the kitchen corner, while my family celebrated Brandon's mediocre achievements. But this time, it wasn't about me being ignored. This was about my son's life hanging in the balance. Dad, this is your grandson. He could die. Don't be dramatic, Marcus. I'm sure the doctors are exaggerating the situation. These hospitals always inflate costs to pressure families into making hasty financial decisions. His words hit me like a physical blow. He was suggesting that I was being manipulated, that Jake's life-threatening condition was somehow a scam designed to extract money from desperate parents. We've explored every other option, Dad. The banks won't approve emergency loans. We don't have time for lengthy approval processes. Jake needs surgery in the next 48 hours. Marcus, you need to figure this out like an adult. Patricia and I are tied up with important family obligations all week. We simply cannot get involved in this type of personal emergency right now. Important family obligations. I realized with growing horror that this was New Year's week when my parents hosted their annual social event that had grown more elaborate and exclusive every year. They were busy preparing for their party while their grandson lay dying 15 miles away. The call ended abruptly when Richard simply hung up without saying goodbye. I stared at my phone in disbelief, feeling the familiar sting of rejection that I thought I had outgrown decades ago. David found me standing in the hospital parking lot, my face probably telling him everything he needed to know about how the conversation had gone. They said no, I nodded, unable to trust my voice to remain steady. David wrapped his arms around me, and for a moment I allowed myself to feel the full weight of the desperation and fear that I had been pushing down since Jake's diagnosis. But even in that moment of crushing disappointment, I wasn't ready to give up. If Richard wouldn't help over the phone, maybe seeing Jake in person would change his mind. Maybe confronting them face to face would remind them that this wasn't about money or inconvenience or social obligations. This was about the life of an 8-year-old boy who shared their blood even if they had never made an effort to know him. At 6 o'clock that evening, I made the decision that would change everything. I was going to drive to Cherry Hills Village and confront my parents face to face. David stayed with Jake, understanding that I needed to exhaust every possible option no matter how unlikely success seemed. The drive through Denver's most exclusive neighborhoods felt surreal. Every mansion was decorated with elaborate holiday lights, each display more expensive than the last. I passed houses where single light installations probably cost more than most families spent on Christmas presents, and I couldn't help thinking about the different worlds that existed just miles apart in the same city. When I turned onto the private drive leading to the Sterling estate, my breath caught in my throat. The scene before me was unlike anything I had ever witnessed, even knowing my parents' tendency toward extravagance. The circular driveway was packed with catering trucks from the most expensive restaurants in Denver. A valet parking setup was being installed near the front entrance. Workers were erecting a massive white tent in the backyard, and I could see crystal chandeliers being hung inside it through the translucent walls. A security guard initially blocked my entry at the front gate until he recognized me as family. Walking up the circular driveway felt like entering a different universe. Event staff were everywhere, arranging champagne fountains, setting up what looked like a professional stage, and installing heating units that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. I could hear my mother's voice before I saw her directing the placement of various decorative elements with the precision of a military commander. The crystal champagne goes in the main ballroom. The $500 bottles stay in the wine cellar for VIP guests only. And make sure the ice sculptures are positioned where the photographers can capture them properly. When I stepped through the front doors, the interior of the house had been completely transformed. What was normally an impressive but livable family home had become a luxury event venue that rivaled the most exclusive hotels in the city. Patricia was wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's car payments, along with a diamond necklace that caught the light from every angle. When she finally noticed me standing in the foyer, she barely glanced up from the clipboard she was holding. "Marcus, what are you doing here? We're extremely busy preparing for tomorrow night." I pulled out my phone and showed her the medical reports that Dr. Chen had provided. I explained Jake's critical condition, the timeline for surgery, and the financial crisis we were facing. "Oh dear, that is concerning. But Marcus, you must understand, we have 200 VIP guests confirmed for tomorrow night. Senator Blackwood is coming. Governor Williams will be here. The mayor and half the city council. This party has been planned for 6 months." She gestured around at the elaborate preparations surrounding us, her voice taking on the tone she used when explaining obvious facts to people she considered less sophisticated. "We've already spent $200,000 on this event. We simply cannot cancel or redirect funds now. The contracts are signed, the deposits are paid, everything is arranged." I stared at her in disbelief. $200,000. More than enough to save Jake's life, spent instead on a single night of entertainment for people who already had everything they could ever want. "Mom, Jake is dying. This is your grandson." Patricia adjusted her pearls nervously, her eyes darting around to make sure the catering staff couldn't overhear our conversation. "Marcus, family reputation matters. This party isn't just a celebration. It's an investment in our family's future business relationships. Do you have any idea how many potential contracts your father could secure tomorrow night? How many doors this event could open?" I realized with growing horror that she was actually trying to justify choosing a party over Jake's life by framing it as a business decision, as if networking opportunities were more valuable than her grandson's survival. The sound of expensive shoes on marble floors announced my father's arrival. Richard Sterling entered the grand foyer wearing a custom tuxedo that probably cost more than most people made in a month, polishing his Rolex with a silk cloth. "Surely you understand we cannot jeopardize relationships we've spent 30 years building. Your personal crisis cannot take precedence over family legacy." The words hit me like physical blows. Personal crisis. As if my son fighting for his life was nothing more than an inconvenience that I had failed to manage properly. Behind my father came Brandon adjusting his bow tie, with the casual confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. Next to him walked Sophia Blackwood, elegant in a designer gown that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She was checking something on her tablet, likely the guest list for tomorrow night's extravaganza. The tableau before me was perfect in its cruelty. Here stood the Sterling family, in all their wealth and power, dressed for success, and surrounded by the evidence of their priorities. And here I stood still, wearing the wrinkled clothes I had slept in at the hospital, begging them to value my son's life. "Dad, it's maybe $80,000 for the down payment. You spend more than that on Mom's jewelry." Richard's face hardened into the expression I remembered from childhood, the one that appeared whenever I had the audacity to question his decisions or priorities. "Those are investments, Marcus. This party represents potential business deals worth millions. Your personal crisis cannot take precedence over family legacy." Brandon let out a laugh that sounded more like a snort of derision. The sound echoed off the marble floors and crystal chandeliers, making it seem even more cruel than it already was. "Marcus, seriously, you show up here in hospital clothes expecting us to cancel the social event of the year because you didn't plan properly. Have you tried GoFundMe? That seems more appropriate for your situation." Sophia shifted uncomfortably beside him, clearly sensing that this conversation was spiraling into territory that even she found distasteful. She whispered something to Brandon about timing, but he waved her off with the dismissive gesture of someone who had never been told no. Jake isn't our responsibility, Marcus. You made your choices when you decided to marry a man, adopt instead of having biological children, and run a small business instead of joining the family company. Actions have consequences. The words hung in the air like poison. This wasn't just about money or timing or business obligations. This was about Brandon's fundamental belief that my life choices had somehow forfeited my right to family support and, by extension, Jake's right to live. My voice cracked when I responded, the emotion finally breaking through the desperate control I had been maintaining. This is about a child's life. Patricia stepped forward, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger. She looked around nervously at the catering staff who were trying to pretend they couldn't hear every word of our family drama unfolding in the grand foyer. Marcus, you're embarrassing us in front of the staff. Security cameras are recording everything that happens in this house. Please don't create a scene that could damage our reputation. The irony was staggering. She was worried about security footage capturing her family's cruelty, not about the cruelty itself. The image mattered more than the reality, even when the reality involved her grandson's life. Richard moved closer, his voice taking on the authoritative tone he used in business meetings when he needed to establish dominance. We've worked too hard building this family's standing to let personal drama destroy it. Family reputation affects everyone, including you, Marcus. Your business benefits from the sterling name whether you admit it or not. That was when I realized the full scope of their delusion. They actually believed that my success was somehow connected to their reputation, that I owed my achievements to being associated with the Sterling family name. They had no concept that I had deliberately built my business independently, using my own name precisely to avoid any connection to their legacy. The party preparation continued around us as if nothing unusual was happening. Workers hung lights, arranged flowers, and set up sound equipment for tomorrow night's celebration. The contrast was surreal. Life or death decisions were being made in one corner, while party planners worried about champagne placement in another. I could see security guards positioned near the entrance, clearly ready to escort me out if this conversation continued much longer. The message was unmistakable. I was no longer welcome in the house where I had grown up, the place that should have been a refuge in my darkest hour. Standing in that marble foyer, surrounded by evidence of wealth that could easily save Jake's life, I finally understood the truth about my family. They weren't just neglectful or distant. They were actively cruel, choosing their social standing over their grandson's survival. December 30th arrived with me returning to the hospital completely devastated. David took one look at my face when I walked through the PQ doors and knew immediately that my parents had failed me once again. He didn't ask for details. He just wrapped his arms around me while I stood there, feeling like the 14-year-old boy who had watched his family celebrate everyone else's achievements while ignoring his own. Jake's condition had worsened overnight. Dr. Chen now had exact surgical estimates and was pushing for a final decision by noon on December 31st. The surgery would cost $185,000, and Jake's oxygen levels were declining despite the medical interventions. Time was running out in the most literal sense possible. I broke down completely in the hospital chapel, finally allowing myself to cry for the first time since Jake's diagnosis. David held me while I sobbed, both of us facing what seemed like an impossible reality. Our son was going to die because we couldn't afford to save him, and the people who could easily afford it had chosen champagne and caviar instead. That's when my phone rang. Margaret Thompson's voice was urgent but steady when she spoke. Marcus, William and I need to see you both immediately. Can you leave the hospital for 1 hour? I was confused, but desperate enough to grasp at any possibility. David and I drove to the Thompson family home in the working-class Highlands neighborhood where they had lived for 30 years. Their simple ranch house was filled with family photos spanning decades, Jake's artwork covering the refrigerator, and the kind of warmth that made everyone feel welcome. Margaret and William were sitting at their kitchen table, with financial documents spread out in front of them. The scene looked ominous, like they were preparing to deliver bad news of their own. William spoke first, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what he was about to say. "We're taking out an equity loan against the house." I immediately started protesting. This was their home, their security, the only major asset they had built over decades of hard work. They were both retired, living on fixed incomes, and this house represented everything they had worked for. Margaret's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained determined. "Jake is our grandson. This house is just wood and brick. We can live anywhere, but Jake only has one life." She pushed the paperwork across the table toward us. It was an equity loan application with Tom Harrison at First National Bank, a man who had been their banker for 20 years. The approved amount was $180,000, based on their home's current value of $245,000. The funding would be available January 1st. William explained that when he had called Tom and explained the situation, the banker had expedited everything, working through the weekend to process the application. Tom had grandchildren of his own and understood that some situations required immediate action regardless of normal business procedures. "We remember what it's like to be young parents facing impossible choices," Margaret said, reaching across the table to take my hand. "We won't let you face this alone." I tried to refuse their offer, overwhelmed by the generosity, but horrified by what it would cost them. They would be taking on debt payments that would stretch their retirement budget to the breaking point. They might have to sell the house anyway if they couldn't keep up with the loan payments. But David's parents were absolutely firm in their decision. "This is what family does. Real family." Margaret added something that has stayed with me ever since. "Marcus, we've lived in this house for 30 years. We've raised our children here, celebrated holidays here, built our life here. But all of that was just preparing us for this moment when we could use what we've built to save someone we love." For the first time in days, I felt genuine hope. Jake was going to live because two people who had no biological connection to him had chosen love over financial security. They had chosen him over their own comfort and stability. The contrast with my birth family was so stark, it was almost surreal. People who shared Jake's DNA had refused to help, while people who had no blood connection to him were willing to sacrifice everything. That night, I realized I had finally found my real family, and they had been there all along. December 31st, New Year's Eve. Jake's surgery was scheduled for January 2nd, and the payment arrangements were complete thanks to the Thompson family's incredible sacrifice. David and I spent a quiet evening in the PICU, watching Jake rest more peacefully than he had in days. The new medications were helping his breathing, and for the first time since this nightmare began, we had real hope. At 8 o'clock that evening, my phone buzzed with a text from Lisa Rodriguez, my college friend who taught music at a local elementary school. The message was brief but urgent. "You need to see this. I'm so sorry." She had sent me a link to Instagram stories from Brandon's account. What I saw made my stomach turn. The Sterling family's New Year's Eve party was in full swing, and it was everything I had witnessed being prepared multiplied by 10. Brandon was posting live updates throughout the evening, each one more extravagant than the last. Celebrities I recognized from television were mingling with politicians. A champagne fountain dominated the center of the main ballroom, surrounded by ice sculptures that probably cost more than most people's cars. The caption on his first post read, "Sterling family throws the party of the decade. $200,000 well spent for an unforgettable night." I sat in that hospital chair, holding Jake's small hand while watching my family celebrate 15 miles away. More videos kept appearing on social media from various guests who were documenting what they clearly considered the social event of the year. Patricia appeared in a Society photographer's video, discussing the months of planning that had gone into the evening. She spoke about achieving event planning perfection, detailing the celebrity chef flown in from Las Vegas for $25,000, the live orchestra from Los Angeles for $30,000, and the custom fireworks display that would cost $35,000. Richard was captured on someone's phone discussing potential business deals with Senator Blackwood while they sipped champagne that cost $500 per bottle. The conversation was casual, relaxed, as if they weren't standing in a room paid for with money that could have saved a child's life. But the moment that broke my heart completely came at midnight. Brandon proposed to Sophia during the champagne toast right as the custom fireworks display lit up the Denver skyline. The proposal was elaborate, clearly planned to coincide with the party's climax, and the guests erupted in applause, as if they were witnessing something magical rather than obscene. Someone had posted a detailed breakdown of the evening's costs in the comments section of one video. Celebrity chef, $25,000. Orchestra, $30,000. Fireworks, $35,000. Venue decoration and ice sculptures, $40,000. Premium champagne and catering, $70,000. The total came to exactly $200,000, just as my mother had promised. At the stroke of midnight, while I held Jake's hand during his scheduled oxygen level check, Richard Sterling posted a family photo with a caption that will haunt me forever. The Sterling family celebrates another year of success. Family values and legacy matter most. Here's to priorities that build lasting greatness. Family values. Priorities that build lasting greatness. The bitter irony was so sharp it physically hurt. Here they were toasting family values while their grandson fought for his life because they had chosen social status over his survival. I screenshotted every post, every video, every comment. Not because I was planning revenge, but because I needed proof for my own sanity. I needed evidence that this had really happened, that my parents had actually chosen champagne over Jake's life. The contrast was surreal. In one world, my family was celebrating their wealth and success, with Denver's elite posting about family values and lasting legacies. In another world, 15 miles away, their grandson was connected to machines that monitored every breath surviving, only because two retired people had chosen love over financial security. David found me staring at my phone, tears streaming down my face. He didn't ask what I was looking at. He just took the phone gently from my hands and set it aside. That night, as Jake slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, I made a promise to myself. I would never again seek approval or support from people who had demonstrated so clearly that their priorities lay elsewhere. Jake would grow up knowing who his real family was, and it wouldn't be the people who shared his DNA. January 2, 2025. Jake's surgery began at 6 a.m. with Dr. Chen leading a team of 8 specialists in the hospital's most advanced surgical suite. The procedure was scheduled to take 8 hours with hourly updates provided to families waiting in the surgical lounge. David and I weren't alone during those endless hours. Margaret and William Thompson arrived before sunrise, carrying a thermos of coffee, homemade sandwiches wrapped in aluminum foil, and William's worn leather Bible that had seen him through decades of difficult moments. They settled into the uncomfortable waiting room chairs, as if they planned to stay for days if necessary. The first few hours passed slowly but steadily. Initial incision successful, mass location confirmed as expected. Delicate work around blood vessels beginning. Each update from the surgical nurses felt like a small victory, proof that Jake was strong enough to handle what Dr. Chen had described as one of the most complex pediatric surgeries she had ever performed. But at hour 5, complications arose. The bleeding was more extensive than the imaging had predicted. The mass was attached to more tissue than anyone had realized, requiring additional surgical time and expertise. Dr. Chen called in 2 additional specialists, and the estimated completion time extended from 8 hours to potentially 10 or more. I found myself pacing the hospital corridors, unable to sit still while my son's life hung in the balance. David spent most of his time researching pediatric surgery statistics on his phone, looking for any information that might help us understand what was happening behind those surgical doors. Margaret quietly worked her way through decades-old rosary beads, and William read his newspaper cover to cover 3 times, just to keep his hands busy. At hour 8, when Jake should have been in recovery, we were told that the surgery was entering its most critical phase. The mass was finally being separated from the surrounding tissue, but the process was taking longer than anyone had anticipated. Dr. Chen finally emerged at 4 in the afternoon, her scrubs wrinkled, and her face exhausted but genuinely smiling. The relief in her voice was unmistakable when she spoke. Surgery completely successful. The mass has been removed entirely, with no damage to surrounding tissue. Jake's breathing will improve dramatically within the next few hours. Recovery will take 2 to 3 weeks, but the prognosis is excellent. The waiting room erupted in quiet celebration. Margaret cried happy tears, while William shook Dr. Chen's hand, repeatedly thanking her as if she had performed a miracle. David and I embraced both of us, finally allowing ourselves to believe that our son was going to live. Jake spent the first night in recovery, looking smaller than ever, but breathing easily for the first time in weeks. The machines that had been keeping track of his struggling vital signs now showed steady, strong numbers that proved his body was healing. Over the next few days, his recovery was remarkable. His color returned to normal, his appetite came back with a vengeance, and he started asking for his model airplane collection and drawing supplies. The medical staff said they rarely saw children bounce back so quickly from such major surgery. David's parents visited every day, despite the financial stress they were now facing from the equity loan payments. They brought Jake new books, helped him with simple crafts, and made sure he never felt alone or scared. Watching them with Jake, I realized I was witnessing what grandparents were supposed to be like. Jake's first coherent words after the breathing tube was removed will stay with me forever. "Daddy Marcus, can we invite Grandma and Grandpa Thompson for pancakes when I go home?" The contrast was stark and heartbreaking. Jake called David's parents Grandma and Grandpa without any prompting from us. When nurses asked about other grandparents who might want to visit, Jake referred to Richard and Patricia as those people who live in the big house. Even at 8 years old, Jake understood who his real family was. It wasn't determined by blood or genetics or shared DNA. It was determined by who showed up when it mattered, who sacrificed when sacrifice was needed, and who chose love over convenience. Margaret and William had proven that family is something you build, not something you're born into. February 2025. Jake was home and recovering beautifully, his energy returning more each day as he adjusted to breathing freely again. I had started returning to work part-time, catching up on client projects that had been postponed during the crisis. Our family was settling into a new normal one, where we appreciated every ordinary moment that we had almost lost. That's when Lisa Rodriguez, my college friend who taught music at Cherry Creek Elementary, posted a message on Facebook that would change everything. Lisa was a single mother herself, struggling to make ends meet on a teacher's salary. But she had been following Jake's recovery with the kind of genuine concern that reminded me why our friendship had lasted so many years. Her post was heartfelt and focused on the power of community support during medical emergencies. She wrote about how inspiring it was to see families come together during crisis, specifically mentioning the incredible sacrifice that Jake's grandparents had made by taking out an equity loan against their home to save their grandson's life. Lisa's post also mentioned, without naming names, how heartbreaking it was when wealthy family members had different priorities during the same critical time period. She wrote about the importance of chosen family versus biological family, and how sometimes the people who love you most aren't the ones who share your DNA. The post was shared locally within Denver's interconnected education and design communities, then began spreading beyond our immediate circle. Lisa taught at a school where many parents worked in media, politics, and business, and Denver's social networks overlap in ways that make it nearly impossible to keep anything truly private. Within a week, KDVR Channel 31 contacted me for an interview about healthcare costs and family support systems during medical emergencies. The producer explained that they were working on a series about how families navigate financial crises during medical emergencies, and Jake's story represented both the challenges and the solutions that communities could provide. I was initially hesitant about any kind of publicity. Our family had been through enough trauma, and I didn't want Jake's recovery to become a media spectacle. But after discussing it with David and Margaret, I realized that sharing our story might help other families facing similar impossible choices. On February 15th, the local news segment aired during the evening broadcast. I told our story calmly and gratefully, focusing on appreciation for the real supporters who had carried us through our darkest time. I mentioned that wealthy family members had different priorities and commitments during our crisis, but I was careful not to name the Sterling family specifically. I talked about the incredible generosity of David's parents who had risked their own financial security to save their grandson. I spoke about friends and community members who had contributed whatever they could, and about the hospital staff who had worked tirelessly to save Jake's life. The interview was measured and focused on gratitude rather than anger, but the message was clear. When a child's life hung in the balance, some people had chosen love and sacrifice, while others had chosen social obligations and personal convenience. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The video went viral on social media platforms within hours of airing. Comments poured in from viewers expressing admiration for Margaret and William's sacrifice and outrage at the unnamed wealthy family members who had prioritized a party over a child's life. But Denver's business and social communities are small and interconnected. It didn't take long for people to connect the dots and identify the Sterling family as the wealthy relatives who had refused to help. Screenshots of Brandon's Instagram posts from New Year's Eve began circulating alongside the news interview, creating a devastating contrast between Jake's hospital bed and champagne fountains. By February 20th, national news outlets had picked up the story. CNN ran a segment about healthcare costs, family values, and wealth disparity in America. Social media researchers had found the Sterling party footage and created split-screen comparisons that made the contrast even more stark. The impact on Richard Sterling's business was immediate and severe. Within 1 week of the national coverage, Sterling Furniture Empire lost 3 major commercial contracts. Customers began canceling orders, suppliers started demanding payment in advance, and longtime employees found themselves facing hostile customers who recognized the Sterling name from the news coverage. The family that had been so worried about protecting their reputation was watching that reputation crumble in real time, not because of anything I had done to them, but because their own choices had been exposed to public scrutiny. December 2025, nearly 1 year later. Thompson Design Studio had grown beyond my wildest expectations. The viral story about our family crisis had led to clients seeking out what magazines were calling designs that heal. Architectural Digest featured our work in a 12-page spread, and our annual revenue had increased to $4.2 million. Jake was thriving in ways that still amazed me every day. He was completely recovered, excelling in school, and had developed an exceptionally close relationship with Margaret and William Thompson, who were now living in a beautiful home that I had purchased for them as a small token of my gratitude. Within 6 months of Jake's surgery, I had paid off their equity loan, entirely ensuring that their sacrifice would never become a financial burden. David had been promoted to regional manager at his construction company, and our family had achieved a level of financial security that we had never imagined possible. But more importantly, we had learned to appreciate the simple moments that we had almost lost. Sterling Furniture Empire, meanwhile, was struggling severely. The business had lost 60% of its commercial contracts to competitors, forcing the closure of 6 of their 12 locations. Massive employee layoffs had followed, and the once prestigious Sterling name had become a liability in Denver's business community. Brandon's engagement to Sophia Blackwood had ended when Senator Blackwood's family publicly distanced themselves from the Sterling scandal. Brandon found himself unemployed and unable to secure positions elsewhere, his reputation damaged throughout Colorado's interconnected business networks. The Sterling estate was facing foreclosure proceedings after months of missed mortgage payments, and Richard's health was failing due to stress-related heart problems that had developed as his business empire crumbled around him. December 29th, exactly 1 year after I had stood in their marble foyer, begging for help, my phone rang. Patricia's voice was shaking and desperate when she spoke. "Marcus, we know we made terrible mistakes. Richard is having serious chest pains and has been hospitalized twice this month. The medical bills are mounting, everything is falling apart, and we're facing foreclosure on January 15th. Her voice broke as she continued. "We need help desperately. Could you possibly lend us money? We promise to pay back every penny with interest. We know we don't deserve your help, but we don't have anyone else to turn to." The irony was complete and devastating. The family who had valued money over life was now facing the loss of both. They had chosen their reputation over their grandson's survival, and now both their wealth and their standing in the community were gone. I let her words hang in the air for a moment before responding, my voice calm and measured. "Mom, I remember exactly 1 year ago when I asked you for help. You said family reputation mattered more than Jake's life. You said the timing was inconvenient because you had important commitments. You spent $200,000 on a party while your grandson nearly died." Patricia was sobbing on the other end of the line. "We were wrong, so terribly wrong. We're sorry, Marcus. We're so sorry. I'm not heartless like you were, Mom. I'll help you, but with one condition. You need to publicly acknowledge that David's parents are Jake's real grandparents. They're the ones who sacrificed everything when it mattered. They're the ones who chose love over convenience." 3 weeks later, I established the Jake Thompson Pediatric Emergency Fund, an endowment that would help families facing the same impossible choices we had encountered. Jake cut the ribbon at the ceremony, standing between Margaret and William Thompson, as they were honored as Grandparents of the Year by the Children's Hospital Foundation. Patricia and Richard attended the ceremony looking frail and diminished, but they kept their word. During the public acknowledgement portion of the event, Patricia spoke into the microphone with a shaking voice. "Margaret and William Thompson are the true heroes of this story. When our family failed to act, they stepped forward and saved our grandson's life. They are Jake's real grandparents, and we are grateful that Jake has been blessed with their love. Today, Jake is 9 years old and thriving. He calls Margaret and William Grandma and Grandpa Thompson, and they have earned those titles through years of unconditional love and sacrifice. He knows the story of how they saved his life, and he understands that family is defined not by blood or wealth, but by who shows up when it matters most." My relationship with Richard, Patricia, and Brandon remains cordial but distant. I helped them avoid complete financial ruin, but the trust that was broken during Jake's crisis has never been fully repaired. Some wounds cut too deep to heal completely, and some choices reveal truths about people that cannot be undone. The greatest lesson I learned from this experience is that sometimes the family you're born into isn't the family you're meant to have. Sometimes you have to build your own family from people who choose to love you, support you, and stand by you when the world seems to be falling apart. Jake will grow up knowing that he was saved not by wealth or social connections, but by love in its purest form. He will understand that true family values aren't about reputation or legacy, but about the willingness to sacrifice for those you love. What would you do if the people who abandoned you in your darkest hour came back asking for help? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and protecting yourself or your children? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might help someone else who's facing an impossible choice. And if this story moved you, please subscribe for more real stories about family sacrifice and the people who show us what love truly means.